Bonjour et bienvenue à cette conférence de presse. I'm Elizabeth Thompson with CBC News. Hello and welcome to this
Recording
press conference.
in progress.
Today with us we have the Correctional Investigator of Canada, Dr. Ivan Zinger, who will be talking about his most recent report. Avec nous aujourd'hui, on a l'enquêteur correctionnel du Canada, Dr. Ivan Zinger, qui nous parleront de son dernier rapport annuel. Dr. Zinger?
Merci, Elisabeth. Good morning, everyone. Bonjour. Mon rapport annuel 2020-2021 a été déposé au Parlement plus tôt ce matin. Ce rapport fait état de l'impact des mesures liées à la COVID sur les personnes incarcérées dans les pénitenciers fédéraux. Il traite également d'une série d'enjeux et d'enquêtes d'intérêt national. Les conclusions cumulatives de mon rapport font état de lacunes sérieuses quant au respect en matière de détention sécuritaire et humaine par le Service correctionnel du Canada. Je voudrais mettre en lumière 2 enquêtes nationales menées par les membres de mon équipe qui sont avec moi aujourd'hui. J'aimerais vous présenter premièrement Mme Leticia Gutierrez, conseillère principale, qui a mené l'enquête sur les cas impliquant le recours à la force, mettant en cause des Noirs, des Autochtones, des personnes de couleur, ainsi que d'autres populations carcérales vulnérables dans les pénitenciers fédéraux. Permettez-moi aussi de vous présenter Mme Stacie Ogg, directrice adjointe et enquêtrice principale dans le cadre de notre enquête systémique sur les femmes. Chacune d'entre elles prendra quelques minutes pour résumer les principaux résultats de leur enquête respective, en commençant par Mme Leticia Gutierrez. Merci.
Thank you, Dr. Zinger, and thank you to all who are joining us today. Our first national investigation examined the intersection of race and involvement in uses of force in federal penitentiaries. For clarity, uses of force involve any actions used by correctional authorities to gain control or cooperation of an incarcerated person. The findings of our investigation are based on a review of 5 years of incident data spanning from 2015 to 2020, representing nearly 10,000 documented use of force incidents. Over the study period, we found that Black, Indigenous, and other peoples of color accounted for nearly 60% of all individuals involved in a use of force incident. Specifically, Black and Indigenous individuals accounted for just over half of all persons involved in a use of force, while representing 37% of the federal prison population. In fact, Indigenous individuals, who on average experienced more uses of force per person than any other group, were also more likely to be involved in a use of force incident. Specifically, Indigenous individuals accounted for nearly 40% of all individuals involved in uses of force, despite representing, on average, 28% of the incarcerated population during this time. We also found that for incarcerated women, Black, Indigenous, and women of color accounted for nearly 2/3 of all women involved in uses of force. And these high numbers were largely driven by the increasing proportion of Indigenous women in federal custody, who, over the study period, accounted for 60% of all women involved in a use of force incident, while comprising 40% of incarcerated women overall. Importantly, our investigation found that regardless of risk level, security level, age, sentence length, or gender, when all was made equal, so to speak, identifying as an Indigenous or Black person alone, that factor alone was associated with a greater likelihood of involvement in a use of force incident. So based on the rather compelling evidence from our investigation, we conclude that force is indeed disproportionately used against Black and Indigenous persons in federal corrections in Canada, and that race is significantly and uniquely associated with the application of force in federal prisons. I'd like to pass it over to my colleague, Stacie Ogg, to share some findings on our investigation into women's corrections.
Thank you, Leticia. 30 years ago, a government task force on federally sentenced women issued a groundbreaking report entitled Creating Choices. Our investigation of women's corrections examined what progress has been made since this report was first issued in 1990. We found that many of the principles and operational concepts of creating choices, including presumption of minimum security classification at admission, no perimeter fencing at the regional women's facilities, no maximum security units, prohibition against segregation have all been abandoned in favor of a framework that puts security and control at the forefront of contemporary women's corrections. Nearly all of the problems identified 30 years ago remain in some form today. These include oversecure infrastructure at the 5 regional women's facilities, use of random strip searching, limited access to the community through temporary absences and work release, inadequate programming, job training, and employment opportunities. Our 30-year review of women's corrections concludes that the original principles of creating choices, empowerment, meaningful and responsible choices, respect and dignity, supportive environment, and shared responsibility have not been fully realized, resulting in questionable treatment and poor outcomes for incarcerated women, many of whom are Indigenous and/or have histories of physical or sexual abuse. I'll now turn it back to Dr. Zinger.
Merci Leticia et Stacie pour votre contribution exceptionnelle au rapport de cette année. En tant qu'enquêteur correctionnel, je suis particulièrement préoccupé par les conclusions de notre enquête sur le lien entre la race d'une personne et les incidents impliquant le recours à la force. La principale recommandation formulée dans le cadre de cette enquête invite le service correctionnel à s'attaquer aux préjudices systémiques et à rendre compte publiquement des changements réalisables en matière de politique et de pratique des recours à la force, susceptibles de réduire les causes de la surreprésentation des Autochtones et des Noirs. In its response, I'm not convinced that the Correctional Service of Canada has either adequately acknowledged or answered compelling evidence of the unique role that race seems to play in how force is applied, how frequently it is used, and against whom. This investigation points to racial bias in the application of use of force in federal corrections. The disproportionate over-involvement of Black and Indigenous persons in use of force incidents, which seems to warrant a response that goes well beyond redoing the work of my office or re-examining the necessity or proportionality of the level or type of force used in these incidents. CC's response to my recommendation, in my view, is defensive and inadequate, and the Correctional Service surely can do better. Permettez-moi de prendre quelques minutes pour résumer d'autres questions et enquêtes abordées dans mon rapport. En ce qui concerne les unités d'intervention structurées qui ont remplacé la pratique de l'isolement carcéral en novembre 2019, mes conclusions préliminaires laissent entendre qu'il y a des problèmes en matière de collecte de données, ce qui limite ma capacité d'évaluer la conformité avec les obligations légales prescrites. Lors d'entretiens et de visites sur place, ironiquement, mon équipe d'enquête a recueilli des preuves suggérant que les unités d'intervention structurées offrent souvent des conditions de détention plus favorables et un meilleur accès aux services et au personnel par rapport aux autres secteurs des établissements à sécurité maximale. En conséquence, les détenus refusent souvent de quitter volontairement ces unités. Those familiar with my reporting will know that I'm a big supporter of Canadian ratification of the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture, UPCAT. Ratification of this treaty would create a framework for independent and national and international inspection of all places of detention in Canada. In 2006, Canada first declared its intention to ratify UPCAT, and the current government repeatedly discommitted more than 6 years ago. 16 years later, we are still no closer to ratification, despite having 116 countries having signed or ratified UPCAT. Accordingly, I repeat my call for Canada to fulfill its commitment by signing on to this most important human rights instrument. Finally, I would like to conclude by raising a more general issue. which concerns the mounting reporting burden that small and micro agencies such as mine face. My office, which has 40 employees and a budget of about $5 million, has the same mandatory reporting requirement as the Correctional Service of Canada, which has 19,000 employees and a budget of $2.5 billion. Just like the service, I'm required to issue 40 corporate reports each year, many of which are redundant or duplicative. The simple fact of the matter is that red tape and unnecessary reporting constrain the delivery of my core mandate. In my estimation, essential element of public reporting, which includes transparency, results for Canadian, performance, accountability, stewardship, and value for money, can be condensed in a single 12-page corporate report. I have appended this 12-page alternative to my annual report for consideration by Treasury Board. Thank you for your attention. I'll be happy to take your question. Merci de votre attention. C'est avec plaisir que je répondrai à vos questions.
Merci. Thank you very much. Now it's time for the questions. Those who would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. Or if you're in the room, go to the mic. It'll be one question and one follow-up. And our first person in the room is Fraser Needham from APTN.
Good morning. Report. I was wondering, just in terms of you seem to say there's a racial bias in use of force in your investigation. Any idea, perhaps, why that is? Were you able to conclude if that's guards don't have proper training in terms of mental health or sensitivity training, or what? Did you get any sense of why, perhaps, there's a racial bias in terms of use of force?
Well, I think in society in general, there certainly is systemic racism in society at large, and it's for me, it's no surprise to see that there's some problem with respect to the criminal justice system and with respect to corrections, more specifically. I think we all have, unconscious biases. But what's most important for me is that when you have an organization, an agency that has a great deal of authority and power over individuals, that they do everything they can to ensure that those unconscious bias don't lead to negative outcome. And this is, I think, what's most important here. So, intention for me is really not an issue when you talk about systemic discrimination. In fact, simply having negative outcome for one group compared to other racial group is, in fact, the definition of systemic discrimination. In terms of, perhaps I can. The kind of things that I would like the service to look into would be that sort of may prompt those racial bias. Would be, for example, if during a use of force incidents, there's a statutory obligation, for example, to try to de-escalate the situation. And it may well be that correctional staff may be ill-equipped to try to de-escalate those situations more effectively when it comes to Indigenous or Black offenders. There may be some cultural barriers. There may be some unconscious bias, and that could explain, for example, why we witness such high rates and been able to basically demonstrate racial bias and the unique contribution of race in use of force.
Okay, and my follow-up is just in terms of, and this is a very quick reading of your report that was just released, is that it appears Corrections Services Canada is moving more toward sort of a coercive type of instruments, I guess. You mentioned sprays, things like that, and also segregation, these things. And it's and you also mentioned the high numbers of course, women that are now, and racialized women, including Indigenous women that are in prisons. That do you see this as a problem in terms of, I guess, what perhaps is the Correctional Service not going in the right way in terms of rehabilitating women, or recognizing some of their unique challenges and pursuing coercion, I guess, rather than maybe other rehabilitative measures?
Well, we have an extraordinary situation when it comes to women corrections. Nearly half of the incarcerated women in federal corrections are from Indigenous background. This is extraordinary. And what we are sort of report this year demonstrate that despite the best intention 30 years ago to do women's corrections differently, over the years we saw those ideals erode, and now we are in a situation where women corrections do not appear to be as women-centered and uniquely delivered as it was initially intended to.
Thank you. The next question goes to Olivia Stefanovic, CBC News. Olivia, I think you have to unmute yourself.
Good morning. Thank you for taking our questions today. I'm wondering, how would you say the corrections facilities can address the fact that they are disproportionately using force against people of color? This doesn't seem to be something that you can just easily address, in a course, for example, especially if people have unconscious bias. So what would be your recommendations, and how long will this take?
That's a very good question. It is not an easy thing to do. I can tell you that the first step for me is for corrections to actually acknowledge that there is systemic racism in their organization. I think acknowledging it would be a first step. I know that perhaps there's reluctance to say it, simply because maybe it'll affect morale, but I think not saying it publicly will affect morale even in a more negative way. And I think, obviously they have to respond promptly and appropriately. And the response that I got is, in my view, again, defensive and inappropriate. They simply don't accept the findings of our investigation. They want to do a consultation with stakeholders and then see whether they can demonstrate whether or not the force was used inappropriately and not proportionately. And then if they do find evidence of some racial bias, they will develop an action plan. I think this is, in my view, very inappropriate. There should be an action plan drafted right now. It should have started as soon as they got my report. And it would include things like, obviously, training and trying to build better relationship between correctional officers who, in general, mistrust prisoners and those who are incarcerated, and try to find ways to be better responsive to their needs and reduce the tension and violence in penitentiaries.
Thank you. And how would you say overall COVID-19 has impacted federal corrections? And specifically, how do you think they should address the issue of medical isolation among inmates?
Well, obviously, the impact of COVID-19 has been very, very difficult. The conditions of confinement are exceptionally harsh. I've issued 3 different COVID updates, and the conclusion in those updates still stand. There is an inordinate amount of time in cells, spent in cells. There's a lot of lockdowns, and all this will eventually lead to delays in early release and parole because there's a complete lack of services with respect to access to programming, for example. As for the medical isolation, I've commented in this annual report about a particular practice that makes conditions much harsher for those who are incarcerated than those that are in the community. Corrections still do not make the distinction between medical isolation and quarantine, and that's wrong. And we have now, probably around 400 active cases in penitentiary across the country, but we have an inordinate amount of people in medical isolation that can last as much as 24, 25 days, which goes well beyond what is the accepted standard by public health or community standard. So all to say is that I know it's exceptionally difficult to run penitentiaries during COVID, and I have a great deal of sympathy, and I certainly feel that a lot of efforts are being put to try to manage those outbreaks or prevent them, but the impact is extraordinary. With respect to use of force, we've seen incredible increases in use of force in the past couple of years. We've seen also increases in suicide attempts and self-harm, and that only suggests the frustration and psychological harm that is going on here.
Christopher Nardi, National Post.
Good morning, Doctor. My first question is just on medical isolation. Reading through your report quickly, I almost get the sense that in some agencies they might, in some penitentiaries, they might be using medical isolation as a replacement for what's it called when they isolate like a prisoner, basically. And so I was wondering, do you get the sense that that's what they're trying to do? That they're kind of swapping out isolation with medical isolation for certain prisoners?
Well, as I say, I think medical isolation is supposed to be managed by healthcare, and it's when somebody has either tested positive or somebody has symptoms of COVID. The quarantine is different. Is that if you've been if there's some risk that you've been exposed to somebody who has COVID. But unfortunately, corrections just mix both and call everything medical isolation. So for example, currently there are almost 900 people in federal corrections with the current inmate population is 12,200 right now. So you've got 900 people in what is called medical isolation. But what we know from the reports of correction is that there's less than 400 people that are actually tested positive. So as to whether I don't think they are using medical isolation as a form of punishment or administrative segregation, solitary confinement. I don't think that's what's happening. It's simply they're being overly cautious, and their routine and protocols are overly harsh on population, on the incarcerated population.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. My other question is going to be much broader. You mentioned it earlier, so presumably you saw it, but just before your press conference began, we got a reaction already from Correctional Services and from the Minister. And I think you pointed this out. In most points, what they basically are suggesting to do is redo the work that you just published on their own and then later come up with solutions. And I've noticed this over the years that they tend to want to do that. I think we spoke last month about the plan for sexual assault and figuring out how much sexual assault was occurring in prisons, right? It took 5 years for them to finish that after your incredible report a few years ago. So my broader question is, do you think that the government takes your work seriously? Obviously your studies are done very in depth, they're very well researched, but it almost feels like the government doesn't really give a crap. Do you get that feeling? Is that a frustration that your office has ultimately?
Well, I've got to tell you that, yes, it's 2 years in a row now that I'm very disappointed with the response of the Correctional Service of Canada. Last year was on sexual coercion and violence, and this year is on the relationship between race and use of force. And absolutely, I'm very disappointed. What I will tell you is that I am encouraged in many ways that the Prime Minister, in his mandate letter to the Minister of Public Safety, included trying to prevent sexual coercion and violence in penitentiaries, and also that that the Prime Minister uses systemic racism in the criminal justice system, which includes corrections, and asked the minister to take some steps. I think where there's a disconnect, and even I would say a cognitive dissonance, is between what those mandate letters from the ministers say and what correction is actually moving in terms of trying to address my recommendations. So I think politically, I think they are doing the right thing. The mandate letters suggest they should be addressing it, but correction for some reason isn't getting those marching orders and effecting changes in a prompt and appropriate manner.
Dylan Robertson, Winnipeg Free Press.
Hi, Dr. Zinger. Thanks so much for taking our questions here. Your report looks at a lot of issues that seem particularly prominent at Stony Mountain. COVID infections, people not wanting to leave the SIUs, the overcrowding. I'm wondering if you think it's time to close Stony Mountain.
Well, let me try to. Yes, there are problems in Stony Mountain. There's problem in certainly Saskatchewan Penitentiary. There are problems in Edmonton Institution. The Prairies seems to be the region which has the most challenges. But let me tell you a little bit about, to give you a bit of background on this. 2 of the 3 penitentiaries that are over 100 years old are filled with Indigenous people. Over 60 to close to 70% of those penitentiaries are housing Indigenous people. So Stony Mountain and Saskatchewan Penitentiary are the 2 of the 3 that are over 100 years. And those infrastructures are, in my view, inadequate. They reflect a very different penal philosophy. So I would say that if they've obviously attempted to renovate and to add new structures inside those penitentiaries, but I am concerned about the ability of those aging penitentiary to deliver modern correctional practices. But I'll give you a bit more background. Right now, as I mentioned, we have about 12,200 incarcerated individuals in federal corrections. Corrections at the federal level is promoting single cell accommodation, which is great. That's the international standard. But they are currently little over 4,000 empty cells in the system, which represent about 8 penitentiaries. That's extraordinary. So in terms of trying to close penitentiaries, I think the time would be the appropriate one when you have such high vacancy. So nationally, we're talking about 25% vacancy rate. In some region, for example, Atlantic region, it's up to 40%. Lastly, Canada has the highest ratio between prisoners and employee. The ratio is now 1.2%, 1.2 for 1. So you have 1.2 employee per prisoner. That's the highest ratio in my mind, and certainly when we looked at other jurisdiction. If you look at Europe, for example, it's about 3.5 staff per prisoner. So Canada, unfortunately, I don't mind about investing in corrections if you have outstanding correctional outcome, but that's not the case. And I think we should be scrutinize corrections and how it's been funded over the years more carefully.
Thank you. And I'm going to double barrel this question because I wasn't clear. Like, I took from your last answer, like, you don't think it's time to close it in spite of all of these different flaws, but I wasn't sure. But I have to move on to my second one, if you'd like to clarify that one. You mentioned the burden of your reporting duties in the office, and I'm just not sure how much of that is a new concern being raised. So can you please walk me through how you've raised this with the government over the years? And, is this a new shift to go public about this concern about the, you can't do your core functions? And have you been raising that internally?
Yeah, thank you. So again, with respect to Stony Mountain, it is not up to me to decide how to make corrections more effective. And where we know that there is certainly pressure on the with respect to Indigenous offender population that is keep growing. I'm looking at as an ombudsman in terms of compliance with the law, and I have concerns about those aging penitentiaries. I have concern that an awful lot of resources being spent, and yet we don't have best practices in every single area of correctional operation. With respect to the mounting reporting burden, you're absolutely correct. This is an internal issue, but an internal issue that puts lots of pressure on small and micro agencies to deliver their mandate. So there's a 3-page summary of the issues in my annual report that details the previous actions and the dialogue that a small steering committee and a network of small micro agency had with Treasury Board. We've obviously made some progress, but the tweaks proposed by Treasury Board have not significantly reduced that burden. We now have some micro agencies and small agencies that are dedicating upwards in 30 to 50% of their resources to corporate services, and obviously that isn't an effective way of delivering on your mandate. So I have there's a picture in my annual report of a 3-inch binder that's all the reporting I have to do every year, and I keep having to increase the services for the resources for my corporate services at the expense of my investigative stream of employees. So I hope that someone covers this issue. I hope that I would be called by Public Accounts Committee to talk about this because we're not getting sort of the response that we're expecting. 12-page compared to a 3-inch binder is extraordinary. I believe that 12 pages paired with issues such as the requirement for proactive disclosure with respect to travel and hospitality, which you can get on every single small agencies and departments across government. Should this kind of reporting should make it more accessible and more accountable than the current system. And I think we need to, as small agencies, to make sure that we put the resources to deliver our mandate and not be swamped with red tape that makes it so difficult to manage those small agencies.
Thank you. Next question, Jacques Galante from the Toronto Star.
Hi, Dr. Zinger. My first question is about the overrepresentation of Black and Indigenous people in prisons, an issue that you've highlighted a lot. I wanted to ask you, Bill C-5, which repeals some but not all mandatory minimum sentences, it's supposed to tackle that issue, but I'm wondering, do you think that bill will make a significant impact or not on the issue of overrepresentation of Black and Indigenous people in prisons?
Well, I support the bill, but I don't think it's the panacea. If I take you back on how we got here, let me certainly let me give you a little, at least part of my understanding of what happened over the years. Certainly during the Harper years, so 10 years of government with the Conservatives, what we saw was incredible increases in the number of mandatory minimum penalties being brought forward. Some of them were struck down because they were unconstitutional, but most of them survived. And at the same time, corrections received a lot of money because we were expecting, at least corrections was expecting, a huge increase in the number of inmates coming into federal penitentiaries. So this is why now we have that incredible ratio of 1.2 staff per prisoner. But that mass incarceration that was predicted never happened. So because it didn't happen, I don't think that by removing those, it will have much of an impact on federal correction. Maybe it will at the provincial level, but that's not my jurisdiction. But certainly at the federal level, I don't think we will see trends being changing because of the removal of those mandatory. In essence, I think what happened is police and courts, when they saw the mandatory, they either adapted because they have some discretion, and that's what happens with discretionary powers. So they had maybe mitigated the impact. It's also possible that basically the mandatory that were imposed were simply a reflection of previous sentencing patterns when you considered aggravated factors. Therefore, people were already receiving about the same sentences prior and after the introduction of those mandatory sentences. So, for example, if you have a new offense that included a gun, well, a gun was an aggravating factor and was already getting harsher sentences. So I think it's good. It's cleaning up. Mandatory sentences are not good penal policy. So I'm very happy that the government is moving that way, but I don't think it's going to be the panacea, and I wouldn't rely just on that to decrease the overrepresentation at the federal level.
Thanks a lot. And then I just wanted to ask you if you could give us some examples of use of force incidents that you were finding in your review.
Well, I mentioned there's a breakdown in my annual report that talks about, for example, that 40% of those, we looked at almost 10,000 incidents, relied on pepper spray. Followed by about 25% of other uses of force, such as baton or things like that. So a breakdown is there. Maybe I'll turn to Dr. Gutierrez to give us maybe an answer on the types of forces that were included in this systemic investigation. So Leticia, could you expand a little bit?
Certainly. Thanks for your question. So we categorize the types of force. There are over 40 different types of force, and we group them into 5 categories. So as Dr. Zinger mentioned, inflammatory sprays, so that includes OC spray, commonly referred to as pepper spray. In over 40% of cases, OC spray was used in some shape or form, either displayed or dispensed. Non-inflammatory spray options, non-inflammatory options, restraints were another category, inflammatory munitions, and firearms. And if I understood your question correctly, there are different reasons for why force is used. It could be assault-related, behaviorally related, in response to self-injury. So those are different reasons for force that we looked at. The most common that occurred was for assault-related incidents, but it should be interpreted with caution. We relied on the CSC's offender management system for this data, and oftentimes we found, and we've learned this through our own internal use of force reviews, is CSC often tends to code the reasons for force based on the most generic or more significant behavior displayed. So, for example, if an incident started as an incident of self-injury, but over the course of that incident, a staff member is assaulted, it may just be considered an assault-related incident. So that needs to be interpreted with caution and understood with those cautions.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Y a-t-il d'autres questions? Thank you very much. This ends this press conference.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.